of cheap labor, and being able to underpay somebody to cut their grass, rather than having to pay somebody a higher wage to do it or do it themselves. And so what I see is, and that's just one example, that, a lot of them come here and a lot of them do work hard, but the benefits accrue more to the rich. They don't accrue to your average American because, your average American can't afford to have somebody mow their lawn. Your average American can't afford to underpay can't afford to have a gardener or to have a maid. So I see it as, what it's done is it's widened the gap between rich and poor. And by the way, I could also argue that all these people that have come from Mexico and Latin and Central America, if they had stayed in their own country, well, maybe there would have been a revolution in those countries, and maybe it would have led to better conditions and a better government. Instead, the people that might have been revolutionaries and overthrown their government and gotten a better living for themselves have all left their country. And I just don't think there's anything wrong with evaluating policy based on whether or not it's more beneficial or not beneficial. And there's very few people that are going to argue that we shouldn't have legal immigration. We need to. Our birth rates have fallen below replacement levels. That's a separate argument, but it goes back to the abortion thing. So we need to have immigration, but unlimited immigration, and is there any country in any part of the world that wouldn't complain or have a big problem with unlimited immigration? If all those, if you had a large group of whites go into immigrate to a majority black country, I guarantee you there'd be a problem with it. If you had a lot of people from East India start migrating into Mexico, there'd be a big problem with it. Of course, Mexico has some of the most stringent immigration laws in the country. Nobody complains about what Mexico does. So does China, so does Japan, so does Korea. They have stringent immigration laws, and I think it's not based on fear. The mistake is arguing that it's based on fear. It's arguing about, does it have good real-world effects? I mean, if it just means that the rich can have an abundant, never-ending supply of cheap labor, and it crowds Americans out of the labor market, then that's not a good thing. Because then what's going to happen is that anytime an employer has an employee that wants a better wage or wants more time off or better benefits, they can say, screw it. Now I got a million, I can just hire somebody else, and it doesn't matter if legally or not, because they'll take whatever I'm going to give them. I mean, it has to benefit the country. And, again, the immigration policies, they hurt the poor and the lower middle class the most. They hurt ostensibly the people that the woman in that clip, for example, running for governor, claims to want to support. But yet you claim to want to support the poor and the disadvantaged, but then you promote policies that put the poor at a greater disadvantage. So, you can't have it both ways. You can't say that you care about the poor, you care about the disadvantaged, that, it's Trump that's this evil racist, but then you support policies that hurt minorities and hurt the poor and hurt, poor working class whites and poor working class blacks. So, either the policies you're promoting help or they don't help. And I think that should be the judge of whether any policy is good for a country. And if they're not good for a country, then a country has the right to want to change them. And there has to be a better argument from the opposition that, well, you're just saying what you're saying based on fear or based on prejudice. It should be whether or not the policy helps more than it hurts. And if it hurts more than it helps, you have to expect that people are going to want to change. Now, you can argue whether the changes people would want are good or bad. There's always, of course, a good discussion there. But, I just don't see how the status quo can be good. And, if we have to be generous, how many people do we let in? We have the most generous legal immigration policy in the world. We let in more refugees than any country. What's too generous? What is not generous enough? What's an immigration policy based on fear, and what's an immigration policy that's not based on fear, but that benefits the country as a whole?
Well, the one thing that is for sure, the bandwagon on what President Donald Trump is working on perpetuating. And as you say, everybody else is playing ID politics. President Donald Trump is playing. What type of politics is he playing in regards to what he's saying and how he's acting? Upsetting the
I think he's a populist.
He's a populist.
And I think they're either at this point somebody's either a populist or an elitist.
That's a trend. That's a flow of ebbs and tides in politics. And you're saying it's a populist. How long do you think his populist ideas are going to sustain him?
I think they're spreading worldwide. I think the election in Mexico, the mistake that the thing that the media is doing that's really crummy is they're playing this guy like he's some left-wing radical when he's been called a Mexican Trump. And I think you're going to find Trump is going to get along better with him than he does Trudeau in Canada. And because Trump respects people that want to do what's in the best interest of their own country. And unlike the Clintons, when they had a natural disaster in Mexico, I think they had an earthquake or something, or hurricane, whatever it was, this guy raised a lot of money, and he actually gave it to the Mexican people, unlike the Clintons, who took most of the money themselves. This guy Almo, I think that's his nickname in Mexico, looks out for his own country, which is, if you're a president of your particular country, and we see this movement spreading in Central Europe and East Europe, maybe in Western Europe, I think you're going to have more nationalist movements spring up in the third world. You're going to have more and more people saying that this system of globalization is a system of tyranny. It's a system where a bunch of, I don't call them elites because I don't think there's anything special about them, but they think they're better than everybody else. So I think they're elitist. But we have a system where these elitists think they have the right to dictate on the rest of the world how they ought to live. And I think you have a lot of people breaking free from that. And it's going to be a mistake if you really believe it's just a white Christian movement. You'll never see the big picture because it's already happened in Mexico, and you're going to see this happen in more countries. And some of these populist nationalistic movements might be more left wing in nature, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But this whole populist movement is going to grow and spread because the way things have been done the last 25 years, there's nothing in it for the average human being. I mean, we've seen the European Union. For example, it's not democratic because if it was democratic and had any vestige of democracy, they would have allowed the Brits to leave when they voted to leave the EU. They didn't let them leave, so they proved they're not democratic. They proved that they're dictatorial. And you look in Asia, you look in the Middle East, you're going to see more nationalist movements popping up in the Middle East. We already have. Why? Because people want the right to determine their own destiny, even in countries like Turkey. Now, I don't agree with everything Erdogan does, but you're seeing that in Turkey. You're going to see that. You've seen that in Syria. And by the way, why didn't they like Assad? They didn't like Assad because Assad was a nationalist. They didn't like Hussein because Hussein was a nationalist. These elitists don't like anybody who's a nationalist. And one of the things they always do to try to discredit you is call you bigoted or racist. But all I know is true nationalists typically are quite comfortable letting the rest of the world determine their own future. They're not the ones that are like a nationalist doesn't tell somebody 3,000 miles away that you've got to live your life exactly the way that I want you to live it, and if you don't, I'm going to come in, invade, bomb your country, and kill you and your family. It's these globalists that do that. Who's killing more people? Who's killed more people around the world the last 25 years? Viktor Orban or George Bush? How many wars in the Middle East did Putin get involved in compared to Bush or Obama or Bush 1 or Clinton? One way I do measure the validity and worthiness of a movement is, how many wars does it get you involved in? Because if it gets you involved in a lot of wars and kills a lot of people, I have a bit of an issue with killing other people. So again, it comes back to, who's the real problem here? I would argue.
Okay, tell me this. What's your opinion? You use words that are very much familiar with such words as elitist, words referring to who are elitists, who are the
some of the names
elitists you're talking about? Yeah.
Well, first off, elitist. I would point out elitist. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with money. Somebody can be extremely wealthy and be humble and be grateful for what they have and not feel that they're better than everybody else. Somebody can be poor and feel that they're better than everybody else. However, the elitists I'm talking about obviously have a lot of money and power, because somebody who's an elitist that's poor is not really in a position to do anything about it. But the elitists I'm talking about are the Jeff Bezos, the George Soros, the Koch brothers, who pretty much control the Republican Party. A lot of the Silicon Valley giants like Bill Gates, a lot of the Wall Street bankers. I mean, just look at the wealthiest, Carlos Slim in Mexico. And this new populist president in Mexico is probably going to get in Carlos Slim's crosshairs. I mean, it's these people that have all this money, and they have, like, I don't know if they don't believe in God. Maybe I'm guessing they don't believe in God, and they have like a God complex themselves. I mean, they really have this belief. They're like these James Bond villains that you always thought were so over the top and cartoonish, but these people really are like genuine sociopaths, and they're the root of a lot of the evil in the world. You know, they're the ones that anytime there's a nationalist movement, they call it socialist, they call it neo-Nazi, they call it racist, they call it fascist, and they have so much success in doing that because it takes your eye off the ball. So instead of me looking at the people that are funding these movements, I just look at the people in the movements and say, oh, they're evil because I'm told they're evil. And I'm not looking at the people behind the scenes that are the puppeteers. You know, I come back to Gaddafi. You know, I mean, Gaddafi was a nationalist. He was a nationalist. He had the highest standard of living of any African country. He provided, you know, the people in Libya had a better chance than any other African country. He gave up his WMDs 15 years ago. He was not any problem of any consequence. And if the rest of the Middle East had looked more like Libya, and I'm not saying Gaddafi was even a good person per se, but he was better than the alternative, then the Middle East would have been in a much better place. And what did they do? They killed him in cold blood. And it ushered in instability, massive refugee flows, lots of people getting killed, terrorism, and legalized slavery. So people like me are bigots and racists because we're nationalists. But people that overthrow the head of the highest country in Africa with the highest standard of living and usher in slavery, there's nothing wrong with them because, you know, as long as you speak well and you're articulate, that's all that really matters. Same thing with George Bush. As long as you want to have a beer with George Bush, doesn't matter how many Iraqis were killed. And I remember him being interviewed before, and he was asked about how many people, you know, were killed in the Iraq War, and he threw a number out like he was talking about like a piece of candy, like they're not even, you know, human lives. And since they overthrew Hussein in Iraq, a large portion of the Christians have been ethnically cleansed from Iraq. So when we talk about white right, I don't think about Trump. I think about George Bush. I think about people like George Bush, like the posers.
Right. Well, look here. I got one more question for you in regards to
sure.
One of the things that you were talking about, that those people that are in power. Hey, little man, come on. Hey, Don. Hey, Don, on in the radio. How you doing? My little man has wakened this morning. His name is Aiden. How you doing? You sleep good last night? Yeah. Granddaddy got about 15 more minutes on the radio. Okay? He's shaking his head. He said no. But I got one question for you in regards to the perspective of neo-Nazis, the elements that have, you say they, say for instance, like under President Donald Trump's reign of 500 or so days, that these people seem to really like what he's doing. What is your perspective on their preference of President Donald Trump?
Well, if you want to use using the broad brush with Trump with neo-Nazis, I think is just, it'd be like me saying Antifa represents the entirety of the Democratic Party. Although I would point out that Republicans and Trump at every turn have made it clear that they find neo-Nazis despicable. They want absolutely nothing to do with them. They don't represent not only the Republican Party, but any party. Now I can look to the Democratic Party, And while I would say that Antifa doesn't represent the majority of the Democratic Party, what I can see